Well, actually, the lesson today could be a topic for a whole quarter. And I'm going to try to synthesize it into a smaller segment or into a shortened time period, because I don't think we want to sit here for a couple of days. But apart from that, the lesson today, there were a couple of weeks ago, we dealt with something that relates to this, but something that we don't always think about is related to today's lesson. So I want to begin by looking at that somewhat briefly, because unfortunately there is a lot of misunderstanding within the church about some of these issues. And I hope to be able to clarify some of them. And I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we were dealing with chapter 8 in Nehemiah. And sometimes we go so quickly through the issues that we don't always think about what they are really saying. But because that lesson is the topic is so interrelated to the lesson today, I would like to begin by looking briefly at least one issue from chapter 8. So if you open your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 8, you may remember, anyone remember what chapter 8 was talking about in Nehemiah?
Public reading of the law.
Yeah, reading of the law. And that is exactly what I would like to really look at. What law were they reading?
Ceremonial law, temple worship.
Okay.
And probably the Ten Commandments.
Yeah. And you see, when you think about, we think about law, what's the, in biblical context, what is it that we primarily think of? Yeah, no, just when you think about the expression law, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? The Ten Commandments, yes. That is the law. But here is talking about the book of the law. So it must have been more than just the Ten Commandments, because it's a whole book. So the question is, what book was it that they were reading? And actually, did you know in that chapter, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 texts in chapter 8 that talks about this law. So let's just briefly look at these and see what it says about it. Verse 1, 8 verse 1. Someone would like to read 8 verse 1?
And all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate. And they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel.
Yeah. So what book was it? The book of the law of Moses. But notice what it says. And this is where the problem comes in. We very often make a distinction between the law of God and the law of Moses, right?
It's the same.
Yeah, but very often the way we speak, we say, here's the law of God and the Ten Commandments, and then law of Moses, and then we think about the ceremonial and civil laws.
But God gave that.
That's right, and that is the important point. That one, and unfortunately, even some of, at least the older books, made very great distinction between these. On one hand, law of God is eternal, but law of Moses, temporal. You see, Yeah, but notice already in verse 1 where it points out, it talks about the law of Moses, what?
Which the Lord.
Which the Lord gave.
Right.
And why is this important? Because often we say the law of Moses was terminated at the cross. And by using the expression law of Moses versus the law of God, we give the impression, even though we don't necessarily mean to, that the law of Moses was something that Moses came up with. We may not think about it that way, but the impression we give, sometimes to those that we're talking to, gives that impression. The law of Moses was something that Moses came up with, in contrast to the law of God, which he gave on Mount Sinai. So we need to be careful how we use the terms. So, but the book of the law, what book would that have been?
Exodus.
Yeah. Well, we don't know exactly. It could be the book of Deuteronomy, or it could be in all of the books of Moses, because they are in Jewish terms are referred to as the law, referred to as the law, as the 5 books of Moses. And that would make sense with the whole books, because it says they read it for several hours. And it does take several hours to read just through, let's say, the 10 Commandments, or just the laws and regulations that Moses came up with. So it must have been quite a bit more. But this is important. Law of Moses, which the Lord God has given. And then in verse 3, it talks about, at the end of the verse, it talks about just book of the law. In verse 7, and also toward the end, it talks about that the Levites did what? They
Cause the people to understand the law.
Yeah, help them to understand the law. So, and then in verse 8, notice how this is spoken there. They read from what? From the book. What book? From the law of God. So, like Doris correctly pointed out, that we have to bear in mind that God gave all of these laws. He didn't just give the 10 Commandments. He also gave the ceremonial law and also the civil law.
But they added a lot of extra stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, in
That was
oral
later on,
tradition.
though.
Yeah,
That was not part of anything.
yeah, that's right. But and then we find also in again in verse 13, end of verse 13, again talks about the words of the law. And then in verse 14, notice it talks about something written in the law, how the what?
Which the Lord had commanded through Moses.
Yeah, and what was it that they read in that particular law? What does the context imply? What was it they read in that law?
It looks like it might have been the ceremonial.
Yeah, because it said they should be living in booths.
Right,
So it's a ceremonial
It's
law.
not the 10 Commandments.
So, yeah. So it shows very clearly that ceremonial law was also given by God.
Yeah.
Even though it was called the law of Moses. And same also, verse 18, beginning. They read what? From the
Book of the law
so the Bible makes it very clear that God is the author of all these instructions. And the laws, actually when we read various parts in the Bible, we find that the law is used much more broadly than we tend to use. We think about laws only as commandments to do or not to do. But it's not restricted to that in the Bible. And then next step below that would be to think about the law as what we find in the books of Moses. But it's not even restricted to that. Just for interest's sake, in Galatians chapter 4, notice, when we go down to the New Testament, but as, in the Old Testament, it makes it very clear that God is the author of all these instructions, whatever form they are. Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 and 22. Anyone who has that?
Telling you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons.
Yeah, okay. All right. Where is it? Where do you find, according to Galatians, where do you find the story about Abraham having 2 sons? If you think about the law as just the 10 Commandments, which of the commandment tells you that Abraham had 2 sons? Which of the ceremonial laws mentioned it?
No.
Which of the civil laws mention it? We would never classify it as law. Where is it from? What would we classify it as about Abraham having 2 sons?
Genesis.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a story. And which would never associate with the idea of law. The thing is, also, Jesus 3 times refers to as it is written in your law, and he quotes the Psalms. And Paul says, as it is written in your law, and he quotes Isaiah. So, and the thing is, the word law in the biblical sense basically means instruction. Teaching, something that is taught in whatever form it is. And I made a small scheme like this. You see, that they can be stories like Abraham with having 2 sons. It's one of the stories, a part of God's history. But there is also what we call laws, like the 10 Commandments. They are kind of the basis. Then we have a civil law and ceremonial law. But Jesus refers to the Psalms. Paul refers to the prophets. And so, in a sense, we become a little bit confused. But when I prepared this, I have to admit I hadn't read what Ellen White had to say about it, but when I looked at the functions, I noticed that there were different functions. The 10 Commandments, they are the basis. And they are basically answer to the question, how does God want us to behave? What does God want to see in our lives? That is the basis. But, it deals with how to walk. But, as I think all of us have experienced, do we always walk the way we should do?
No.
What do we do if we don't?
Hopefully grow sorrowful and repent.
Yeah. And has God made any provisions for that?
Yes.
And what provisions did he make in the Old Testament for that?
The sacrifice.
That's the ceremonial law. So the ceremonial law deals with how to repair when you fail to live up to the basis. And then we also have how do we in practice do the things that God tells us in the Ten Commandments? You see, that's where the ceremonial and civil law comes in. That it shows how to apply it. And lo and behold, as I was looking at now in preparation for this, I noticed very interesting statements by Ellen White in Patriarchs and Prophets. It says, Adam and Eve at their creation had a knowledge of the law of God. They were acquainted with its claims upon them. So they were familiar with what God expected, what to do. Because its precepts were written upon their hearts. Notice then what it says. When a man fell by transgression, the law was not changed, but a remedial system was established to bring them back into obedience. And what was that remedial system? The sacrifices. A ceremonial law. So it came as a repair, a way to repair the problem that was caused by our failing to live up to the standard. And then thirdly, it says, unfortunately, because of the people's condition, he says, the people had shown themselves so easily led astray that he would leave no door of temptation unguarded. Moses was commanded to write, as God should bid him, judgments and laws, giving minute instructions as to what was required. These directions relating to the duty of the people to God, to one another, and to the stranger, were only the principles of the Ten Commandments amplified and given in a specific manner that no one heard. So, what was the civil law all about?
Its basis is the Ten Commandments.
Giving an example. It was not a complete description of every single situation, but took samples on how do you apply these principles in your contact with other people. So,
may I have your reference again there?
this is Patriarchs and Prophets, page 363 and 364, about the law and the covenants. So, it seems it gave me a boost. I seem to be on the right track. That those three types of laws were all given by God, but with a different purpose. This is the basis, the 10. The other two, they were just what to do in response to this requirement. One was about how to repair it, and the other one how to apply it. And these were given under certain circumstances. The civil law was given example how the people in the wilderness and in the ancient world, how they were to apply it in their circumstances. And then if they failed, they had a way out through the ceremonial system, but that's and therefore these two, ceremonial and civil law, they were only temporary, because the civil law only was dealing with Israel under their circumstances. The principles are the same for us today. we might have to apply them differently from what the Israelites did in their time. Because we don't live in a wilderness, do we? No. So our culture and the environment is quite different, so we might have to apply it differently. And the ceremonial law, we were told throughout the Bible, especially in the New Testament, that all the ceremonies that took place in the Old Testament, what happened to them when we come to the New Testament? They are gone. Why? Are they useless?
No.
Were they wrong?
No.
No, because they were only a type or a picture of the real solution, which was Jesus. And this is why these are no longer requirements. Because one has been replaced, and the application is different in our time from their time. But what about the basis?
The basis is still
Remain
good.
same.
They are still valid.
Our very laws are based on that,
Yeah,
aren't they?
that's right. They are still valid. So, and there's no indication that they were ever changed. So, and then actually in Nehemiah 8, 9, and 10, there are 10 texts that refer to the law, and only it took a few of them to point out the emphasis that Nehemiah makes that all of these laws, they have their origin in where?
Ten Commandments.
In God.
Oh.
They have their origin in God. God gave all of them, even though we called some of them the law of Moses. And this is something we need to be careful about, because also when we come to what is the main topic of the lesson today about the covenant, that we say that we talk about Old Covenant and New Covenant and so on, and say these were the Mosaic laws given on Mount Sinai. But they were God's laws given on Mount Sinai. God gave all of these on Mount Sinai. It's true, God only wrote part of it himself. He had Moses write the other part. That's true. But God is the originator of all of it. And you see, then, yeah, just a very brief note. I'm not going to take time to expand on it, but chapter 9 that we dealt with last time. And did you know that chapter 9 in Nehemiah is actually a summary of all the Old Testament? It traces the history of first, all the way from creation. Notice it begins in verse 6. Thou alone art the God, the Lord. Thou hast made the heavens, the heaven of heavens, and the earth, the seas, and gave life, and so on. So it begins with creation and brings them all the way down to where Israel was at the time of Nehemiah. So actually, chapter 9 is a one chapter summary of the history of God's people from creation and down to the time of Nehemiah. And even one further, that in the last part of verse 33, if you could say so, last verse in 9 verse 33 is then a summary of chapter 9. So chapter 9 is summary of the Old Testament, and last part of verse 32 is then a summary of the chapter. And what is that? Does that summary say?
Now be it thou art just in all that is brought upon us, for thou hast done right, but we have done wickedly. Quite a text.
Yeah. Thou art faithful, we are wicked. When you read the Old Testament, does that fit?
Yeah.
So if you want a very, very brief description of the Old Testament, that's it. So it's a lot of things that are kind of interesting in that sense. Then we come to chapter 10, which is the issue for today. And I know we are not going to cover all of it today, so I'm going to continue kind of next Sabbath along with some of that. And I think we might be able to deal with the topic of the lesson without spending time on the pronunciation of all the names.
We're so disappointed.
Because it is dealing with the concept of the covenant. We talk very frequently about two covenants in the Bible. On one hand, we talk about what is called the Old Covenant, and then we talk about the New Covenant. The lesson talks about 7 covenants in the Old Testament, no, 7 covenants. So, what is it? And also, secondly, what is the covenant really all about? And this, and some of the findings that I'm going to share with you, I have to admit, came as a surprise to me as I was studying. That because usually we are associated with God's promise to do various things, and then what people are expected to do, what the people have to do in response. And then when it comes to the Old and New Covenant, we often talk about the Old Covenant is no longer valid, it's the New Covenant that is valid. And I have a small booklet at home that was published a few years ago. It talks about why the Old Covenant failed. And unfortunately, usually we associate the so-called Old Covenant with the covenant on Sinai. And the New Covenant was the one that Christ established at the cross.
It's really the same.
Pardon me?
It's really the same, isn't it, the covenant?
Yes, okay, yeah. And we,
In Jeremiah, it talks about this same covenant as the new covenant.
that's right.
And the new covenant isn't just for the Jewish people, it's for the whole world.
Okay, I'm glad that you seem to be on the right track, all of you. Because unfortunately we have, and see, we need to be careful also how we use that terminology, because if we say the Old Covenant was the covenant that God made with Israel on Mount Sinai, okay, and the New Covenant was the one that was ratified by Christ at the cross. You see, perhaps to show you already now a little bit of connection that came as a surprise to me when I noticed it. If you open up Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13. Moses is talking to the people about the experience on Mount Sinai. And then he said something that I said, I have to admit, it came almost like a shock to me when I saw it. 4:13. Anyone who would like to read that for us?
And he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them upon 2 tablets of stone.
Okay, so what is the covenant? What does it say? What was it that he wrote on 2 tablets of stone? Yeah, and those 10 commandments, they are what? What does it say?
His covenant.
His covenant. So he wrote the covenant on 2 tablets of stone. And actually there are several texts in the books of Moses that refer to the 2 tablets of stone as being the tablets of the covenant. Was that the old or the new covenant?
That is the covenant.
Yeah, and you see, this is why we need to be very careful how we use the word old covenant, that the old covenant has been eliminated. Because what are we saying then? For instance, about the Sabbath. The 10 commandments are no longer valid.
We don't want to say that.
No, and I have to admit, I came as a shock that it says that what we refer to as the 10 commandments, God, through Moses, refers to them as his covenant. So, therefore, the covenant that God made with Israel on Mount Sinai, it has not been eliminated.
Right. And where you read in Nehemiah 9:33,
Yeah.
it talks about that the people were the ones that broke the covenant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They
And-
broke it.
Yeah. And you see, one reason why we often emphasize the Old Covenant was eliminated, we quote in Hebrews chapter 8. But again, there we need to be very careful. Notice very carefully what it says. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7 and 8. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. Anyone?
For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Because finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah.
You see, unfortunately, we emphasize verse 7, which says, had the first one be faultless, so, which implies there was some fault with the first one, therefore it needed to be replaced. But verse 8 tells us what was wrong with the first one.
The people.
It was the people, not the covenant. It doesn't say finding fault with the covenant. It doesn't say that. He said finding fault with them. And what's the problem with them? Go back to Jeremiah, because this is a quote from Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 and 32. Anyone like to read that first?
Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I want to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand and led them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord.
Yeah. Notice, why was it that God wanted to make a new covenant?
Because they broke it.
He said, they broke it, and then he says, even though, what?
I was a husband to
I
them.
was a husband to them. So the problem was not with the covenant. The problem was with the people. The people didn't live up to what was expected of them, even though I was a husband to them. Do you remember one of the most common metaphors that the Bible uses about the people of God? What's one of the most common images that is being used in the Bible about the people of God? Both in the Old and the New Testament.
The bride and the groom.
The bride who is married to a husband. So it's about a relationship between a husband and a wife. You see. And then, if you look at, for instance, Hosea, chapter 2. And you see, the problem was that people were not living up to what they were supposed to. And Hosea chapter 2, verse 2. What does it say there?
Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband.
Yeah. So, was it because God wanted a divorce?
No.
No. People, the people no longer wanted to be God's bride. And you read about this, for instance, in Jeremiah. Again, going back to Jeremiah chapter 3. Jeremiah chapter 3. Verse 7 and 8. Jeremiah 3, verses 7 and 8.
And I said, after she had done all these things, turn thou unto me, but she returned not, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw, when all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went and played the harlot also.
So what does it tell us about God? God is divorced. Did you know that? And why did he divorce?
Because his bride was unfaithful.
Yeah, because the wife did no longer want to be his wife. So God said, finally, I just had to write her a writ of divorce and permit her to go her way. Because God never forces us to be in a marriage relationship with him.
But what about the part where it says, and her unfaithful sister Judah saw it?
Yeah, and God had, you see, the northern nation, Israel, they actually were eliminated in 722. Because since then, those 10 tribes, you don't know what happened to them. They were distributed all over. God said, I just had to let them go because they didn't want to be in a relationship. And God said, I was hoping Judah would learn something from them. But unfortunately, they didn't. But for about over 100 years, until about 605, so it was over 100 years, they still hang on. But then God had to allow them also to go. Not because he wanted, but because they wanted.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the Bible indicates what the covenant really is all about. What is the covenant really all about? About a relationship between a husband and a wife. And therefore he uses that as one of the main illustrations throughout the Bible. And on what is that relationship based? what's the
Faithfulness.
basis of that relationship?
Faithfulness.
Love from God.
It's love. Love is the basis for it. It was not obligation. And to notice when God even gave them the commandments or the law in the Old Testament, where did you want the people to keep the contents of those instructions?
In their hearts.
In their heart. It didn't say keep them. He kept a copy of it in the temple, but he didn't say just keep it there and check it once in a while. He says, write these words which I tell you today, where? On your heart. And then when you obey or live accordingly, on what basis are you doing that?
On your heart.
Because it's a love response. Because you love me, it never says that you do it because I tell you so. Nowhere in the Bible says, you better do this or else. He says, do this, and he says, when you obey them, do it from your heart. Do it because you want to, not because you
Have to.
Isn't it interesting that they used to wear pieces of the law on their clothing actually, and yet it wasn't in their hearts.
Yeah, you see they kept it on the outside.
Right.
They keep it on the outside.
Exactly.
But God says, I want it to be inside.
Right. But they didn't see that connection somehow.
That's right. And this is actually very interesting. When I was in Serbia several years ago teaching, the one who translated for me, he told me about an experience that he had with a friend of his who was one of the leaders in the Communist Party in Serbia. And this communist friend of his said to the pastor once, why is it that you Christians are successful where we are failing? Because if we look at it philosophically, there is no political system as theoretically that comes closer to Christianity than communism. It's not, unfortunately, not the application of it. That is why I emphasize as the philosophical system. And he says, why is it that you are successful when we are failing? And the pastor was thinking, oh boy, how should I answer this? But before he could answer, the communist leader said, I'll tell you why. It is because we try to do it from the outside, but you work from the inside.
Very good. Good answer.
He realized it. That in order for things to work, is that it has to come from the inside, not just from the outside. And that's exactly what the Bible is saying. And what is also interesting, what is pointing out, you remember there in Hosea, it said that you are no longer my wife, and you are no longer my husband, and I'm no longer your husband. But what we have found in ancient documents, this formula that Hosea uses was the official divorce formula in the ancient world. For instance, in Egypt, about 400 years before Christ, there was a very, very powerful Jewish community in a city called Elephantine, and they had a very close connection with the leadership in Jerusalem. And in documents from them, there is, we have documentation, like for instance, what today is referred to as prenuptial agreements. They had it already way back there. They were telling this man, the son of this, belonging to this family, is going to get married to this lady who is part of this family. And when they get married, this is what he is going to bring into the family. And this is what she is going to bring into the family. Then comes the interesting thing. And bear in mind, this is in a Jewish community. Because often we think when it came to divorce, it was only a man who could divorce his wife. But this document shows if one day the husband should say to his wife, I'm no longer your husband and you are no longer my wife, then this is how they should divide the property. And if she one day should say, I'm no longer your wife and you're no longer my husband, this is how they should divide their property. So what is the formula? I'm no longer your husband, you are no longer my wife. It's a legal declaration of divorce. And that's what you find here in Hosea. And this is in the Jewish community. It was supposed to be based on love, but it is not forced on them. So if the covenant is then a legalization of a love relationship, and the 10 Commandments, according to the Bible, are the covenant, what does that tell us about the 10 Commandments?
It's supposed to be about love, kept by love and not without shadow.
Yeah. And that, it tells us that the 10 Commandments are about a relationship. Right?
Yeah.
If the covenant is about a relationship, and the 10 Commandments are the covenant, and the covenant is about the relationship, then the 10 Commandments are about the relationship. It is not about obligation.
And that's exactly what Jesus said.
That's right. He doesn't say, in order, if you want to get married to me, then you have to do this, and when you reach a certain standard, then I will accept you. And actually,
There's only two laws, really.
yeah. And actually, also, you have heard it said that in the Old Testament, people were, I'm not saying that Adventists do it, but a lot of people say, Christian people, say in the Old Testament, people were saved by works. They had to do this and this and that, and so on. Do you know what is the strongest argument against that? It's the structure of the book of Exodus. Where is Israel in the beginning of Exodus, book of Exodus?
Slavery.
They're slaves in Egypt. Then God decides that He is going to do something about it. Were they living up to God's covenant when they were in Egypt? No, it was absolutely impossible for them. Do you think they had a Sabbath off, for instance? Every week? No. But what did God say? Did God send Moses to them and say, in about a year I'm going to save you, but you have to shave up before that, so you qualify to be brought out? Did he say that? No. What did he do? He sent Moses in order to bring them out. And what was the only requirement that was basically given to them?
The doorpost they
Yeah, you have to show that you want to be part of it. And the only thing was they had to paint the doorposts and then be ready to go when Moses said, go. When did the 10 Commandments come into the picture in the book of Exodus?
After they were in the wilderness.
It was about 3 months later. About 3 months later, he gathered them on around Mount Sinai. And then he introduced them by saying in Exodus chapter 19, and after the time is up, and this is what I knew would happen, and this is why I said I would try to continue it a little bit next time. But look at what it says in Exodus 19, verse 4. What message does God send to Israel through Moses?
What I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself.
Yeah. So basically, what is God saying to them? You have seen what I've done for you. When you were hungry, what then? I provided you with food. When you were thirsty, I provided you with water. Did you like it? Do you want to continue that? Do you want me to continue to work with you that way? Then he says, if so, then show it by living up to my covenant. So what is the story of Exodus telling us about salvation by works? Just the structure of the book itself tells us that they had been traveling over more than 3 months before God even mentioned to them the idea of obedience to the commandments. See? So it was salvation by faith. They had to trust in God. And you remember, they had difficulty doing that. A couple of chapters earlier, remember when he gave them the manna? He told them, there's so much that you can pick up each day. But on Fridays, you pick up double. Because you are not going to get anything on the seventh day. Did everyone do that? No. You see, and you see, some of them, they piled things up on, let's say, Sunday or Monday, and wanted to have some extra food going to next day. What happened to it?
It rotted.
It molded and but then on Friday, what they took there, you see, on the experience, basis of experience, would they have believed in taking a double portion on Friday? No, because on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, if they did it, I mean, it was useless. But then on that day, they were supposed to do it. What about tomorrow? Are we not going to eat anything tomorrow? You see. But what happened is Sabbath morning? They had that day's portion ready for them that day. And what happened to them, those who didn't believe in that, and only picked up the Friday's portion on Friday?
Did not have anything to eat.
They didn't have anything. So can you see how God was teaching them the idea of faith? They had to trust Him, and that trust came before He gave them the commandments. So, I mean, the strongest evidence against salvation by works is just in the structure or the story of the book of Exodus. It tells us that the idea of works didn't come until much later. And then it was supposed to be from the heart, based on faith.
You know, somehow they never caught on that God gave these rules for their own benefit.
That's right.
And could it be maybe because they were still in the mindset of slavery?
Yeah.
You're doing this, and that's it, don't even question.
Yeah. You see, time is actually more than up, but we are going to continue next time. And in the meantime, I would like for you to study this. I have, let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
20.
Yeah, I should have enough for everyone. Take one copy each of these. And there's a chart in front But then there are very interesting statements from Ellen White that are included on the other pages. And look at these, and we look a little bit closer at that issue next Sabbath. Let's have a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that you loved us. Thank you that you want to redeem us. Thank you that you want to bring us into a relationship with you. Relationship that is based on love and not on works. Help us in our walk with you today and always. In Jesus' name we pray. Thank you. Amen.
Amen.